Hello, welcome back. It's good to be with you. In this lecture, we will conclude our discussion of the origins of Christianity and our discussion of the New Testament. Let me share my screen with you and we will get started. Okay, so we've been talking about Jesus of Nazareth, who is the central figure of the Christian tradition. We talked about how the gospel writers um, connect him. They draw a line of continuity between Jesus and the hoped for Messiah of the Jewish tradition. And they do that through a wide variety of rhetorical techniques throughout their gospel. So just like the Jewish people spent 40 years in the wilderness, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. Just like there's 12 nations or tribes of Israel, Jesus has 12 disciples who are a continuation of those tribes of Israel. And again, you see these points of continuity between Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and the Jewish tradition. Jesus also pushes back against the misunderstanding of the Jewish tradition and the Jewish law amongst his fellow Jews. So, for example, for example, um, when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and some Jews push back against him for healing on the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath, the holy day of the week, is supposed to be a day without any work. And these Jews are interpreting Jesus's healing someone as work on the Sabbath. And Jesus famously responds, humanity was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for the human. And by doing that, Jesus is suggesting, or he's stating, that his fellow Jews are misinterpreting the purpose or the meaning of the Sabbath. Surely one could heal on the Sabbath. Laws are not supposed to be used in an oppressive way, but laws are supposed to be sweet and for our benefit. And laws shouldn't get in the way of helping others, such as get in the way of healing the sick. And so Jesus does push back against those within his Jewish communities that are misunderstanding, misinterpreting, misusing the law. At the same time, Jesus says in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 5, verse 17 of Gospel according to Matthew, he says, "Don't get it twisted. I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law." So moving onwards, another key moment within the Gospels related to the life of Jesus is when he gives to Peter the keys and says to one of his close disciples, and says to Peter, "Whatever you bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosened in heaven." And so he seems to give some level of authority to one of his closest disciples, Peter. The same disciple, Peter, and that's what's captured here in this mosaic down below. The same disciple in the middle of the gospel according to Mark, when Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" So he asked him, "How do you understand my identity?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And then Jesus warns him, "Do not tell anyone," because he wasn't ready to let the news kind of spread outwards. And he began to teach right after that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be killed. Hearing this news, Peter took Jesus aside and he rebuked him. He said, "No, that's not possible. That's not what the Messiah is supposed to do. The Messiah is not supposed to die on the cross. The Messiah is supposed to be the liberator of the Jewish people from Roman oppression." In response, Jesus looked at his disciples and he rebuked Peter. And metaphorically, he calls his friend Peter, who later he's going to give the keys of heaven and earth, he calls him Satan. Because Peter was setting his mind not on divine things, but on human things. He was trying to get in the way of Jesus fulfilling his mission, which was to die on the cross, according to the Christian tradition, for the salvation of humanity. So this is a key pivotal moment in the gospel according to Mark, because once Jesus reveals that his destiny is to die on the cross, and after Peter tries to intervene and Jesus rebukes him, from this point onwards in the gospel according to Mark, which is 16 chapters, from the 8th chapter onwards, the rest of the gospel focuses on the last week of the life of Jesus, including his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. So that suggests, right, that illustrates that the importance of how Jesus died is important to the gospel writers. It illustrates their character. So just like the death of Socrates, the Greek philosopher, illustrates the manner of his character. Likewise, the gospel according to Mark, by focusing on the death of Jesus, reveals the character of Jesus. On the cross, Jesus cried out, pardon me, Jesus cried out with a loud voice in Aramaic, which was his native tongue. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, surely this man was God's son. And so here you have the beginning of the gospel according to Mark. Recall in the Jesus's baptism in the Jordan River, you had a voice coming from heaven along with a dove, which represented the Spirit of God. And the voice from heaven said to Jesus in that first chapter, you are my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. And then you come to the end of the gospel according to Mark, and you have again the identity of Jesus being affirmed, but this time not by the voice coming from heaven, this time from an unexpected source, the Roman centurion who was charged with overseeing, pardon me, overseeing the crucifixion of Jesus. He says, truly, this man was God's son. So that's important. We have the identity of Jesus affirmed at the beginning and at the conclusion of the gospel according to Mark. Likewise, it's important that embedded within this account, Mark is giving us a theological interpretation. He's supplying us with theological significance regarding the crucifixion of Jesus when he asserts that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. He's referring to the inside of the Jewish temple, which was destroyed in 70 Common Era. He's referring to within the temple, there's the inner sanctum. It is the most holy room in the center of the temple that is protected by a curtain. And only once a year would the Jewish high priest enter into that inner sanctum, into that holiest of holiest rooms. And on the altar in the middle of that inner sanctum, he would make a bloody sacrifice. He would make a bloody sacrifice, animal sacrifice upon the altar in order to make atonement for the sins of the people of Israel. This whole ritual, this whole act happens on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is one of the holy days within the Jewish calendar. And so to assert that when Jesus breathed his last and died on the cross, that temple curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, in which only the priests entered one day of year, has been torn from top to bottom. It's suggesting that sacrificial ritual to make atonement for the sins of the people is no longer necessary. That's why the temple curtain tears from top to bottom, because that ritual of sacrifice is no longer necessary. Why? Because Jesus has become the perpetual, the eternal sacrifice, who atones for the sins of the people of God. You have non-Christian sources, not many, but there are a couple sources outside of the Christian sources, which briefly reference the crucifixion of Jesus, including a source from the Roman historian Tacitus, also the Jewish historian Josephus, and from the Roman um, Suetonius. These just have brief mentions, but the vast majority of information comes from the gospels themselves when it comes to the life, the teachings, and the death and resurrection of Jesus. Indeed, according to the tradition, at the end of after the crucifixion, according to the gospel tradition, Jesus was resurrected and appeared to his followers and said, "Go to Jerusalem and wait for me, and I will send you my helper." And then they're in Jerusalem, and the Acts of the Apostles, which is the fifth book of the New Testament, recounts that while they were reigning in Jerusalem, the Holy Spirit came upon them and gave them the gift to speak different languages. And with this gift, they were given the power to go beyond the Jewish people and go to different people across different geographical, cultural, and linguistic boundaries and preach the gospel, preach the good news of Jesus. And this begins the movement of the early church, which gets recounted in the Acts of the Apostles, which is the fifth book of the New Testament. So the resurrected Jesus, again, instructs his followers to go to Jerusalem and wait for the helper, the Spirit to come upon them, and it does. And so the Acts of the Apostles, it recounts the movement of the Holy Spirit from the time in Pentecost, when the early Christians are waiting in Jerusalem as Jesus commanded, onwards to its movement to the eternal city of Rome. Of note, you have a key figure in the Acts of the Apostles, Saul, who was a Jew who persecuted Jesus until he has this transformative experience and becomes renamed Paul and goes from being the persecutor of Christians to becoming the leading Christian missionary to the non-Jew, that is the Gentile. Within the Acts of the Apostles, you have this key moment, which is the Council of Jerusalem, wherein it was decided that Gentiles, non-Christians who joined this Jewish movement, which eventually will become Christianity, do not have to be circumcised and do not have to follow Jewish kosher dietary laws. Remember that within the Jewish tradition, the sign of the covenant was, the eternal sign of the covenant was, on the eighth day, every male, if they have after the birth, every baby male is to be circumcised. So the question emerged, well, what about converts? What about those who weren't raised in the Jewish tradition but convert to this Jewish movement? Do they have to be circumcised as adults? And the answer provided at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 was no. So this was a major decision. It kind of cleared the way for the inclusion of Gentiles into this Jewish movement as it expands. And so the Acts of the Apostles, it provides us with a historical theological narrative of the early Christian community and its movement from Jerusalem to Paul's missionary efforts, and concludes with Paul being imprisoned under house arrest in Rome. The early church, according to Acts of the Apostles, was a group who believed in all their heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything was held in common within the early church. And so the main missionary in the Acts of the Apostles is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is a significant figure in the history of the early church because 7 of the writings that comprise the 27 writings of the New Testament are letters that were written by Paul to churches that he helped found throughout the Mediterranean world. So we'll pick up the story with the Apostle Paul, and that will conclude our time talking about Christian origins in the New Testament in our next lecture. All right? Okay. Sounds good. Let me do this here and say thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. So we'll have one more lecture on the New Testament, and then move into some issues and movements throughout the history of the Christian tradition. Okay, thank you so much. Take care.